the film itself is a problem. But then there's the question of, do you make it or do you not? And by not making it, again, there's a big conundrum for me personally, is that I do think the responsibility lies with the privileged to empower those that aren't, because we are the ones that are oppressed. So there is some responsibility that we all hold, and which does not in any way mean that I have the right to give Lata a voice, because she already has a voice. This idea of like give the downtrodden a voice, to me, is a very problematic idea, because that is saying that they don't have a voice. They have a voice. It's our problem that I can't hear it. And it's not my place to give her a voice, but it is my place to create a platform for her to speak. When you are not making space for the audience to participate in the film, where I can sit back and I can have this magical, spectacular life of hardship and poverty and pain happen on screen, and by the end of the film, it's resolved, and something beautiful happens to that character, and I'm absolved of my guilt. And I don't have to think about it anymore, and I get to leave the cinema with this magical story. But life doesn't resolve itself. Life actually mostly ends in questions.
I was curious to know where you have grown up and what kind of films have you grown up watching, and what are the kind of other influences that you had while growing up, just in terms of art or just other things around you. Where did you grow up, and what are the kinds of things that you were doing growing up?
So I grew up in Bombay. Actually, the house that the film is shot in is my own house. And that was a very specific choice. I used my house, I used my family members. We used a lot of the watchmen and drivers in my apartment complex were part of our crew. For me, shooting the film in my house was, I don't know if it succeeded at doing that, but it was very much an attempt at like making clear that I was critiquing a system that I was a part of, the system that I was born into, that has a system whose the privilege on whose back I've been riding this whole time, right? So I think something I, as a filmmaker, struggle with a lot, and I'm really conscious of, is sort of this politics of like the aesthetics of the working class, and how the upper class makes a lot of films about the working class because we're so fascinated by the lives and difficulties and this like underdog story type thing. But there's never any acknowledgement that everything that we do is based on their lives, and that their lives are not just stories to be told. And actually, we don't know their lives at all. So that's one, that the film was shot in that house. I was born and raised in that house. It's my mother's house. I lived 18, 20 years in that apartment complex before I left. Let's see, I grew up in Bombay, went to school in Bombay.
Which part of Bombay?
South Bombay, grew up in South Bombay. So that apartment is in Nepean Road. Again, these were the like small ways for me to make clear to my audience that like I come from what I'm critiquing. So yeah, I grew up in South Bombay, went to school there, and then I eventually left for boarding school in 10th grade, and I went to Kodi. I grew up in a very typical, well, in some ways a typical Gujarati business family, in that there wasn't really any art in the family. It's not like anybody went to art school or like the regular expectation of like, oh, you're smart, you should be a doctor, you should do this. But I will say that I got very lucky with a mom who never, like my relationship to art was all infused by her. Like I remember being in school and like, I really hope nobody knows any of the teachers in my school. But I remember my mom, like I would get a message upstairs in class that the principal has called me downstairs because your grandmother's really sick and like you have to go down now. And I'd run down, be like really stressed out because I was a very geeky child. I didn't like to miss school. I studied, like I was that kind of annoying person. And then I would go outside and basically my mom would put me in the car. I'd be really stressed out, crying. And once we like left the school lane, she'd be like, oh, I have tickets to this foreign film. I needed to get you out because there's only one screen. and we'd like go all the way to the other side of town, and I'd be screaming in the car being like, but we have an exam next week, like what do you do? She's like, it's fine, school will come and go, you have 15 years of it, it's a waste of time. And she'd like throw me in the car, and this would happen at least once a month, if not more.
Wow.
And each time it was some unusual excuse. I think at some point, like the teacher started to catch on, but then she had said that my grandparents were terminally ill, and like this whole story had been made until, and like I remember even during my ICSE exams, there was like a 2-week break. You know how you have those 10-day breaks between big papers? And she found out that there was a screening of Kieslowski's Blue. I was what, 10th grade is what, 16, right? Yeah.
Yeah, so 15, 16, yeah.
15, 16, and she found out there was this one screening and it was playing at Central Plaza, which was the only place that used to play foreign films. That, and there was one more in Santa Cruz. And it was the day before the exam. And it was a 10 p.m. show at night, because I remember they would show these films either really late at night or really early in the morning. She took me at 10 o'clock before my ICSE paper. I was screaming, fighting. I think I had a really bad relationship with that film because of her. But it was how I got introduced to like anything. Whatever thoda foreign cinema came to Bombay, which is not a lot, was because she would either do this or we had a membership at Shimaru, and she like had pestered them and was like, any cinema that's coming that's not Bollywood, basically. She was like, I'm on the list first, I want it. And I remember watching things at like 10 and 12 that most people would think is quite inappropriate for a child. Because a lot of these foreign films have a lot of like sex scenes, a lot of violence. And we'd watch them, and if I very embarrassingly shared this story at a Sundance interview once, and I shouldn't have shared it. But I remember
अब तो
watching
बोल दिया ना, अब क्या बोलने वापस?
बोल दिया, अभी क्या करें? But it was I remember the film, it was called My Left Foot, and there was this very intimate scene, and I was very young, I must have been 10. And the scene is happening, and instead of the usual where parents will fast forward or stop or rewind, she paused the scene. And she said, okay, now watch carefully. And I remember just looking at her, and then we watched the whole scene, then we paused the film, then we had this huge discussion around sex and what it means and depiction and also like masculinity, and then we rewound and watched it again, and I was like, Ma, I have to go now, I can't continue this anymore. So I do think that was a very large, like in some small way, influenced a lot of like how I watched. I don't think it's that I watched a lot of amazing things. I maybe managed to watch as much as most people growing up in Bombay at that time would have watched if you were seeking out anything outside of commercial cinema. But that was really kind of it. That, or like museums, it was all really my mom who would like drag me to these things. I remember being like our first trip abroad, I only wanted to go out at night, and she wanted to wake up at 7 and go to the museums. So we had to have a deal, like one day was museums, one day was partying, one day was museums, one day was partying. So I would drag her out till 5 a.m. and like basically she was my wingman. And then she would wake me up for the museums and I'd be half asleep. So I think that was my only relationship really, was my mom. It's not that my family was extremely artistic or like anything like that. Yeah, so I finished boarding school. That was 12th grade. I did decide very early that I wanted to leave, which I think has its pros and cons. In some ways, there's a part of me that wishes I had stayed back and done at least my undergrad in India. There is that like missing for it, because it's a very different experience. But I was very hell-bent on leaving, maybe because I didn't want to do engineering or medicine. So there didn't seem to be any other option. And that, at least I remember growing up, and art only meant technical drawing. And I didn't want to do TD. So I didn't really know much about art. Like now I know, obviously there's NIT, there's Shrishti, there's all these amazing schools, but I didn't know anything about it. So the only way to do anything that wasn't those two subjects was to get out. So I applied I touchwood got a scholarship, and I ended up going to a liberal arts school in the US, where I studied nothing related to cinema, nothing related to art in the traditional sense, but I did transitional justice in post-conflict societies. So my focus was very much based in like the overlap between history, economics, and human rights, specifically related to post-genocide Rwanda and post-apartheid South Africa. It's like a very specific area of study, very different from anything I did now. But I do think the interest in like human rights and its intersection with political structures and societal structures has carried forward in my interest. So I did that for undergrad. I worked in that space for quite a while, mostly with NGOs in South Africa, and did a lot of research based between Johannesburg and Rwanda. And then again, the mother interjected and I was ready to apply for a master's at a very specific program. Actually, most people are big fans of Meera Nair. I was a very big fan of her husband, Mahmoud Mamdani, because he is a big writer in the transitional justice space. And he heads the program at Columbia. I don't know if he does anymore. He heads the program at Columbia, which is a master's in international law and transitional justice. And once you do the program, it's a master's PhD combined, and you would live in Uganda and work specifically under him researching. And I was obsessed with him as a teenager. I had sent him my thesis that I had done in undergrad. God knows. He had replied, actually. I highly doubt he knows who I am, but he did reply, which I highly respect. I didn't even know he was married to Meera Nair until many years later, once I became a filmmaker. So I was all set to apply to that program. I got in. Well, I didn't get into that program, but I was applying to that program. And that's when my mom sort of again intervened and was like, I think you're making a mistake. I think you need to take a pause. Like, I can see the toll that this like academic life is taking on you. Because there was a part of me that was quite frustrated with academia. I felt very stuck in academia. And she gifted me, she urged me and gifted me a small sabbatical in a small art school in Greece. It's not a school. It's not even like it's not like an established school. There's no degree associated with it. It's just a center that is called the Aegean Center for the Fine Arts. It's in a small island called Paros in Greece. And she was like, you have to go. I had found this school ages ago. I had been dreaming about it for I don't know how many years, but again, not even like I had any family pressure, but I just feel like societally also you don't grow up in India being like, oh, I'm going to go learn how to paint. There was some internal pressure in myself that I had to first get a degree in something that would make me money. Not that transitional justice or NGOs made me any money. Yeah, I ended up going to that program. It was supposed to be 3 months. I was supposed to be a photographer, like experiment with photography, which I was always interested in and did as a child. And then I was supposed to apply to Columbia. I ended up living on that island for 4 years. I photographed, but I became more interested in painting. Those teachers and that place became family to me, and I sort of stayed for 4 years in exchange of like helping them run the school. I would sweep the courtyard, I would like do all these things, and in exchange, Jane and John let me study with them, like directly under them. So I ended up assisting Jane, who was the painting teacher, and John was the photographer with whom I did a series of large format photos, and I learned how to develop. But yeah, so they kind of really just became like mom and dad to me in some weird way. I stayed there for 5 years, and it's them again who like pushed me to leave the island and were like, you need to do cinema. You dream about it. And you can't do cinema on this island where there are like 1,000 people, out of which 500 are like old nonyas and nanas. So I think that period was the most influential period in my life. It was my first experience of the arts in any way or form. I had never painted before. I had never like developed or photographed anything fancy. I had like a digital camera. I learned a lot about like light. I learned a lot about printing. Mostly painting. I think for me, painting was a huge influence. And the school is a very like classical arts focused school. So I did a lot of specifically focused on oils and specifically on the masters and the Renaissance period. And like Jane's perspective on any art was that talent is a joke and it's mostly curiosity that runs things. Sure, you might have like a flair for something, but talent will only take you that far. Everything else is curiosity. And that like you first learn all the rules of the masters before you break them. So that was very much how my relationship to the arts and training in the arts was very classical. And that was my first real encounter. Like everything from like Vermeer to like Rembrandt to sort of classical painters. I mean, I discovered some of our own artists sitting in Greece because nobody had ever like really shown it to me. I knew names because of my mom, like Raja Ravi Verma, and like I knew but even my mom, she taught me what she could in her best capacity, right? Because she also grew up in a specific type of Gujarati business family. So she would like read things somewhere and then give it to me. So I think it was my first opening. And after that, I think I had the courage to be like, okay, I want to be a filmmaker. I never wrote to Mahmood Mamdani again.
You wrote to Meera Nair then? Do you write to
No,
Meera
I
Nair?
didn't. I still have my loyalty still live with him, but I still read like all his books. But I do think it informed my interest in cinema and like what kind of cinema interested me. But I didn't really know anything about cinema yet. I just decided after those 4 years and with the help of John and Jane that like, okay, I have to try this thing. That if I don't try it, I will very much regret it. So I returned to Bombay and decided that in my logical brain that I had to first get on a set and see whether this was some sort of like fantasy dream or I actually enjoyed the life of a filmmaker. So I ended up assisting as like I was fourth assistant director where basically I did the clap. You know, when you see the like scene one, that was me on Death in the Ganj with Konkana. And so I did that with her. And after that, for a very brief period, for about 2 or 3 months, I worked with Nandita Das as a director's assistant for Manto. But I left halfway. So like before Manto even hit the floors, like when I joined her, she was still like it was a 3-person team, me, her, and one other person. And she was still revising the script and looking for funding and everything. And then 3 months in, alongside that, I had started applying. And again, it was like after doing Death in the Ganj, for me, it was a choice like to stay. And there was one path, which was to, a lot of people said, stay, you have got your foot in the door, you're working with filmmakers like Konkana, and now you're working with Nandita. Most people would tell you not to leave. But to me, I realized that there were 2 paths. One was to keep ADing and like staying on set like this and learning the logistics of set. And eventually one day maybe making something, but relying very much on the system or like the larger sort of commercial filmmaking system to approve your work. And I knew I didn't want to do that because I just knew very fast that that wasn't the kind of cinema I wanted to make. I don't think that cinema doesn't have its place in our society. It does. It's just not the cinema that interested me. So, or that specifically that structure of working felt very tight to me, with no room for like experiments or exploration. So I applied to one school, only one, because I wanted to replicate my experience in Greece, which was so profound for me that I wanted a school that didn't have this like track system, which is one of the major reasons FTI was a place I didn't apply to, was because they do sort of track you into director, producer, you have to pick what you want to do. And I didn't even know anything about film to be able to say, I want to do this or I want to do that. And painting and photography had influenced me so deeply that I wanted a place that would let me just explore the arts as a medium. So I had found after a lot of research, this one school in LA that even when I researched it, I learned this, and then when I came here, I realized it's very true. It's like the stepsister of these like big art schools. If you look at the list, it's like number 5 on the list of like one of the best schools in the world, but it's also in LA considered like literally the stepdog, because we don't do a lot of like traditional industry oriented work. We don't have tracks. They believe in authors, that like a filmmaker should know all their elements and all their mediums. It has a lot of its pros. The cons are obviously that they don't teach you anything technical. You really have to learn it all yourself. But it is a much more theory, slightly more intellectual, looking at like the relationship between aesthetic and politics, looking at like, you know, we discuss those things more and spend more time in school looking at that than teaching a camera. Like, it was a master's program at a really expensive school in the US, and they only had DSLR cameras. Like, that's how little they cared about whether you were on a, I don't know, like a fancy Aton 16 millimeter or you were on a 35. Like, they didn't care about that stuff. It was more about the image and like its relationship to psychology, society, like those sorts of things. But I knew that's the kind of place I wanted to go to. So I applied. Nandita knew I was applying. Actually, I had already gotten in by the time I started Nandita's film. And I had already gotten in by the time I met Nandita, but I had been such a big, after seeing Firak, I was like, oh, if there's anyone I want to work with in the industry, I'll work with Nandita. So because she said yes, and I was like, okay, I'll defer my application, I'll stay. So I stayed for about 2-3 months, and then Nandita herself was like, I think you should take the opportunity and go. And they gave me a scholarship, touchwood, again. And I left and came to LA to do a master's in film. It was also one of the only schools that didn't need you to have any experience in cinema to do a master's degree in cinema. Actually, they preferred it if you came with no experience. Obviously, everyone prefers that because then you're empty and they can indoctrinate you, but which they have, unfortunately. So yeah, they didn't need it. So no other school, all the other schools wanted either an undergrad or relevant experience, or you've made a short film, which I hadn't done any of those. So for CalArts, you had to submit a film. I remember YouTubing like how to make a film and like using a DSLR to make a short, and like YouTubing, editing, and I think I edited on iMovie when I submitted, maybe. I got into CalArts, and then I did my master's here, and Lata was my thesis. So it was a long, very long journey. I only came to cinema at like very late. Like, I think most people, at least in my class, everybody had done undergrads in cinema, and like I came to cinema. I think I came to my master's at 29. So it was a very late endeavor and a career switch, and I'm still not making money, but I am very happy. So
That's amazing. That's a proper. And there are so many lessons that I've just learned in this thing that you just shared with us, and there's so many things I want to double click on. But I think Prana just wrote something. Prana, do you mind just elaborating on that? I would love if more people could be involved in the conversation.
No, I just said that your work essentially in undergrad and on social justice and uncovering genocides and addressing them. I'm sorry, I cannot name the course exactly, but I guess it's
yeah,
related to,
that's fine.
yeah,
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 yeah.
yeah. So it reminded me of Patricio Guzman as a filmmaker and his film Nostalgia for the Light, essentially, which is about trying to uncover the horrors that happened in Chile and that are essentially lie in the Atacama Desert, and juxtaposing that with a search for the past in the stars, and sort of
Yeah,
that sort of reminded me, because that is a film I'd seen at Prithvi Cafe in Mumbai, at
yeah,
essentially a screening at Vikalp, where they screen all these indie documentaries and which are exclusively about social justice and restorative justice. So
yeah,
my question essentially to you about the film was a very short one, as since you there is so much there about, because the camera is so static and you're just showing this the intersectionality of the spaces that these two classes are inhabiting.
Mhm.
So for you, is the camera itself sort of an absolver of the guilt that we all have living in these enclosed in these privileged gated communities? And is the camera the absolver of guilt that the upper class would have, or is it essentially just a window into this fractious state that we stay in? What was your approach to that? Because you spoke of cameras also in your postgrad as sort of the image itself being so powerful and so meaningful. So
Yeah.
how was that approach for you?
I think for me, definitely, I don't think there's any absolving of guilt, firstly, in this situation. I also think living in guilt is not fruitful. I think guilt is in itself a very privileged state of being. You can only be guilty once you have a certain level of privilege. So I think actually that was a very big question and a big line that while making this film, I think one of the biggest questions that both me and so my producer, who is also my real life partner, but also my filmmaking partner and co-writer, she co-wrote the film. We both talked a lot about the fact that there is no way to make a film like this without it being problematic, right? Like its very existence is a problem. The fact that we need to make films like this means a system that is problematic exists. So, and no matter what, there's no escaping the fact that for me, taking me as an example, forget everybody else. I make a film like this. We collaborate with someone like Shobha, who plays Lata, who is in real life a domestic laborer. What does it mean to make a domestic laborer come and on screen play the exact same thing that they're living in life? It doesn't in any way free her from her life. And I will continue as a filmmaker, and I've again ridden on her back. So there are all these problems that we spent hours trying to mitigate all this, that the politics around it, and at some point realized there is no mitigation to the problem because the film itself is a problem. But then there's the question of, do you make it or do you not? And by not making it, again, there's a big conundrum for me personally, is that I do think the responsibility lies with the privileged to empower those that aren't, because we are the ones that are oppressed. So there is some responsibility that we all hold, and which does not in any way mean that I have the right to give Lata a voice, because she already has a voice. This idea of like give the downtrodden a voice, to me, is a very problematic idea, because that is saying that they don't have a voice. They have a voice. It's our problem that I can't hear it. And it's not my place to give her a voice, but it is my place to create a platform for her to speak, because that is something that I have privilege and access to that she doesn't have. There are many ways to do that. Either you make a film or you write a book. You could also give the camera to her. There's multiple ways to do it. But so I think for me, the decision to have static frames came from multiple places. One very honest place that it came from is that it was my first film. And I knew that I couldn't handle, I was not prepared or ready to handle 85 moving parts. I had to put limitations and restrictions to myself. And one of the limitations I knew right from the beginning was static frame, long shot, because I'm interested in what time does. And the film is essentially about the privilege of time. How I spend my morning eating breakfast is not how the people that clean the space spend their mornings. So if the whole film is looking at the privilege of time, then the camera should also take its time. So that was one very clear decision for a very practical reason. But also to me, the camera took the place of the observer. And where I think it complicates the gaze is that I wanted the audience to feel that we're looking into something, because even though, because living in the US, there's this whole thing, right, about belonging to the community, being Indian, so you have the right to say whatever you want, or you're African American, you can say whatever you want. But even in those larger categories, we're all outsiders to certain societies. And as an upper class, upper caste member, I am an outsider to many societies, and I hold a lot of privilege. So to be cognizant of the fact that I'm an outsider to the life of a domestic laborer, I wanted there to be a lot of distance every time we put her in the frame, that I am looking in. I am also in some way participating in both observation, but observation and voyeurism is a very thin line. and to be cognizant of that distance and that her space, her body in space, her thoughts, her mind, there is privacy there. And to cross that line is also to say that I know what you're thinking. I have no idea what you're thinking. And like I did get, while writing the script, the biggest pushback that I got from a lot of people, some professors, some filmmakers, was that you're not using the close-up successfully. Like I'm not feeling the character. Like I don't know what she's thinking. I don't know what she's feeling. And for me, yes, it's true, writing characters is hard for me. But it was also very clear that I had to find a way to write this character without going close, because the thought of a close-up on her face just was very disturbing. And the thought of trying to put some backstory of like, oh, my father this and my mother this, again was sort of this poverty porn pity I view that I didn't want, because I don't think she's asking for pity. And sure, there might be a very rich emotional life, but I don't know that emotional life. And I don't have the right to comment on it. And to pretend that I'm close to her, to have that emotional life is a complete lie, because in our society, that's not how structures work. So I think all of those things led to the fact that I knew the camera had to keep distance. We had two rules. One was the distance from the camera, static camera, three rules. And the third rule was that the camera moved with Lata's eye level always. So even if the shot is not pretty, it doesn't matter. If she's sitting, the camera moves down. There's no top angle shots and there's no low angle shots ever. Always at eye level. So these were some of the rules we had around camera choices.
I wanted to actually, I wanted you to elaborate on the part you mentioned about the thin line difference between voyeurism and observation. Could you give us more examples, maybe through your work or just any other work? Like if I'm watching a film, for example, growing up, for example, Slumdog Millionaire came out when I was probably 6, 7, 8 years old. So I loved the film back then because kaise mix kiya unne, all the questions coming in his mind from his real life, and just really interestingly made and all of that. But people also mentioned how it sort of a sense of poverty porn in that, or some other films also. There's been a mention of that. What are those elements that we need to look for when we can create that distinction for us as viewers of cinema?
I think something that has helped me, because again, it's especially in narrative work is where it becomes difficult, right? Because there's also the fact, like somebody once, actually I was very young and it was a fellow, I don't know, I guess she was a friend, we were friends for a while, but mostly just someone I had met that was working in media, who was very young and said something really what I thought at the time was very wise, where she was like, sometimes fiction can do much more than what documentary can do, right? Because when you watch such large evils in the world in documentary, made in a traditional documentary sense, right? Which is somebody talking and then facts and whatever. It all feels so large that you watch it, you embrace it, but you don't know how to insert yourself. What do I do? How do I fix the problem of child labor? I can't fix it. I'm not using children in my house, for example. I'm not saying documentary work isn't powerful. It is. I think for me, Lata's a documentary, but that's a different story. The power of fiction is the ability to have the audience participate and sort of find a stake in the character, which instantly puts you in a position of wanting to do. But I think that's where narrative gets tricky, is that this idea of wanting the audience to connect to the character so that they can feel the same pain is relying on the fact that our experiences of life are equal and our privilege to experience emotion is equal, which is not true. So I personally don't believe in the universality of cinema. I believe in the universality of being able to experience cinema. I think it becomes voyeuristic for me when you are, again, this is all my opinions, but like when you are not making space for the audience to participate in the film, where I can sit back and I can have this magical, spectacular life of hardship and poverty and pain happen on screen. And by the end of the film, it's resolved and something beautiful happens to that character, and I'm absolved of my guilt. And I don't have to think about it anymore. And I get to leave the cinema with this magical story. But life doesn't resolve itself. Life actually mostly ends in questions. How many stories have we heard of people dying and there are 50,000 things unanswered? Life is about questions, not answers. And I think that's where observation comes in, that if you observe really keenly, there is a story everywhere. But that becomes a story only when that specific event is demanding my participation. It's asking me, what are you seeing? Why is it happening this way? What would happen if it happened a different way? As opposed to cleanly tying a bow on top of it and giving me a gift. So I think that's the thin line where, like, you know, even with Lata, there were many questions of like, what is this ending? Or like, why don't you end on the frame where she's dancing? For me, again, ending on the frame where she dances is this sort of happy, resolved ending where, like, oh, look, she's finally free, as though I can free her on screen. She's not free. She had a moment of freedom and joy because, like everybody else, no matter what your hardship, there is always moments of joy. But she still returns to work the next day. And for me, maybe it's brutal, but I didn't want the audience to leave without knowing that she comes back to work, because that is the reality. And like, yeah, I think that's the line. I do think sometimes that's where spectacle can get tricky, is that to spectacularize the mundane there's sometimes a problem in it if that spectacle is not leading to questions. If it's just leading to like, here's an answer, then I don't know what, like, you go to the cinema, you fall asleep, you have this entertainment and you leave, but you haven't taken anything away from it.
What happens is that the limitation of cinema is that a film ends, but life doesn't end, or like but a film has to end. A film ends and there's things happening after that as well. That's something that comes to my mind a lot. So my question is that आपको भी ऐसा लगता है क्या कि you're making a film about somebody, but the people who are actually watching it are people in the festival circuits first, and then a certain audience who is watching it on movie, or let's say on Prime Video or something else somewhere else. Do you see a gap in the, and also the form, that in the way you're making it? Because like in a very general perspective, somebody from the masses, from the lower middle class and lower classes, would probably watch a film which is made something like a Pushpa or something more massy in that way, might not have the taste for a film like this. Do you feel that wo gap रहता है? And because you're talking about guilt at the same time as well, do you tend to, because of the ways in which you have studied social studies and other forms of art as well, is there a sense of, like, in a subconscious level, is there a sense of trying to overcompensate for some sort of for some sort of an ancient guilt that you're carrying? Because I tend to do that a lot. I tend to overcorrect myself. I tend to be more politically correct about things. There's this sense of guilt that always in my head, because I also, even though I'm not a Gujarati, I have grown up in Gujarat. I have a business family, and again, not a connection with art in any way. But I'm trying to overcompensate right now, trying to understand things from different lenses, how different people would see those things. Do you tend to do that?
This is not a fully formed thought, but I'm going to say it anyways. I don't necessarily think that overcompensating is always bad, in that sometimes you got to do the work. And for us to do the work, and by us, I don't mean you and me, I just mean you and me included, but there's all of these conversations, and much more and louder conversations about privilege, about Dalit rights, about caste, happening in India, which is amazing and it needs to happen. But if you really look at it, there have conversations not happening on the top. The conversation is being pushed from the bottom up. For the up to participate, we're going to have to learn. And to learn, you have to sometimes overcompensate, which means to be extra careful about every word you speak and be willing to say, I'm sorry when you say it wrong. My biggest learning from making Lata was recognizing my own blind spots, like my own class issues, my own caste issues, things that I never even thought I had, because in my mind I was very liberated. But in making the film and having to engage with the subject matter so deeply and having to talk about it so carefully to my cast, to my crew, but also to my own family, who couldn't understand why I was putting them in the film, because they felt blamed. They felt like I was saying they're bad people. And that was a huge conversation with my whole family. I think I realized that it's okay for us to overcompensate. I also think it's kind of high time. Like, because the less privileged and the less sort of, or the minority has had to overcompensate in other ways consistently, right? They've had to overcompensate or like fight to make space to be seen, to be heard. So if we have to overcompensate a little bit to like really question where everything comes from, then that's okay. Again, I don't think guilt is of any use. And I think if guilt is the driving force to compensation, then great, but then let it go. Because carrying the guilt forward, again, starts just a pity party. I think it can be a useful force to get you moving. But after that, starting to read, starting to learn, starting to be really careful about how you use your space, I think it's okay. And I think we have to go through a period of like this upper crust overcompensating a little bit to make space for the crust that didn't get to rise, you know? Yeah, maybe there is a part of me that is overcompensating by trying to make a film like Lata, but I'm okay with that. Like, I think if in this process of me attempting to reckon with my own privilege and my own space in society and reckon with the systems that we live with, two other people start to think about it, then it's helpful. And then they have to start their own journey of thinking. The film isn't going to give you any answers, and the film isn't going to change anything. But in that sense, the only way art changes is that it can change how you think, I think.
The distinction between whom you're making it for, who you're
The
making it
festival
about.
circuit and the audience.
Yeah, that way.
I mean,
Because we tend to over intellectualize these things. Like even while watching every frame of the film, this film or any other film which talks about anything political, I mean every film in that sense is political, but something which is specifically talking about some, let's say, classism or casteism, we tend to over intellectualize those frames. So in that sense, I wanted to ask.
So of course there is a gap in terms of, and I think that gap is not just for necessarily political films. I think it's a gap for independent cinema in India in general. I mean, there's incredible cinema coming out of India, like, and I think most people aren't getting to watch a lot of it, right? There's a very specific elite that gets to watch it. I only got access to so much of it once I moved here. So there is that gap. I personally don't believe, and I know people will argue about this and tell me I'm wrong. I don't believe it's because the quote unquote like general public doesn't know how to consume anything beyond a film like Pushpa, for example, using the example that you used. I think it's the other way around. I don't think it's demand that controls supply in this case. I think it's very much the distribution channels that are relying on the fact that the audience is dumb. And the more you rely on that, the dumber the dumb will get. So essentially, like everything else in this capitalist world that we live in, we're just, the more you hypnotize the audience with spectacle, the lesser the expectation, the more sort of you're training them to consume it, right? Like even watching, for me, when I came to Cal Arts, I remember the first time I watched a film by Apichatpong. I don't know if anyone has watched his work. Some people are nodding. He's a Thai filmmaker, right? Yeah, he's a Thai filmmaker. His like roots of filmmaking are quite experimental. Long shots are a thing for him. He also, like, all of a sudden ghosts will appear. You don't know who's living, who's dead. He's interested in mythology, but his work is quite tough. And the first time I watched it, my whole first week at Cal Arts, I was asleep. like every time they turned on a film, my eyes would doze and I would fall asleep. Because, and I remember thinking like, is this a movie? Like, what are we watching? Nothing is happening. It took me a month of being exposed to all of this stuff to even realize that, like everything else, it's a muscle. If you stop eating, your jaw will weaken. And if you stop consuming interesting things, and like if you stop reading for 2 months, reading again becomes hard because it's a muscle. So using your brain is also using a muscle. And the more the distribution channels insist on dumbing the population, the more we're taking that muscle away. I don't think the population is dumb. I think the capacity to watch interesting work isn't absent. I think it is in the benefit of distribution channels and in the benefit of capitalism that the population stays dumb. So I really, and I know this is not a favorable opinion, but again, in my version of overcompensating is to say what I think, and if there's backlash for it, then so be it. But like, I do think that's the problem. And that's why a lot of this work doesn't reach India. Because honestly, I think there's a little bit of fear that once good work starts to come, this other work's not going to be consumed. It's like once you taste a really good cheesecake, you won't eat a frozen cheesecake. You'll eat it sometimes because there is some nostalgia and joy to eating that frozen thing, but you're not going to eat it every day. So it's a muscle. And I think training that muscle is where the distribution channels come into play and capitalism comes into play. So it makes sense that they don't want this work to be seen. In this specific film, yes, I really wanted the film to go to India more than anywhere else, more than festivals. Of course, this is where it gets tricky, is like for an emerging filmmaker, a film like this would not find any funding in India, sadly. I knew that it would be very hard to get screened in India, but I also knew that I needed, basically, you need a thappa. That's sadly how the world works. And the thappas come from the West because our colonial structures are fully in place. And matlab, once the West says this is good, everybody says it's good. So I had to get a thappa. It was really beautiful that the film screened, you know, all these amazing places, but eventually I wanted it to screen in India. I think with Lata, where we got lucky, or not lucky, where there was some, at least for me, what felt like a clear strategy was that I knew the audience of this particular film was the upper class. I don't think the working class needs to watch this film. They can watch it. Of course, I'd love, but it's like asking someone that does this one activity every day to go and watch that same activity, right? Like the audience was very clearly a specific audience. The audience was my family and people like my family. And so based on that, we started screenings in India. Movie was a very specific choice. A film like this on Netflix would get buried and would not hit the right audience. And I think the strategy was, bhale audience chota rahe, but at least it hits to the people that need to watch it. So in that sense, it fit very clearly where it's working, which is another reason why like Sankalp screenings like this make me really happy. And like I will say yes to all of them because I think the film needs to be seen and this is the audience that needs to see it. And even Mubi in that sense is a little bit elite in that you have to pay, right? So as many screenings as we can do, I'll do. But for me, that gap of like, oh, it's not hitting, for example, a certain sector of society. Of course, I want it to go there, but if it doesn't go there, the film is still doing what it needs to do, and was written for this audience.